Unbelievably, it's been nearly 2 months since President Trump took office, and predictably, it's been a very eventful presidency so far, and I think all of us are kind of sitting on the edges of our seats wondering what's going to happen with international policy and what he's going to do next. Not least, of course, the financial markets and so on. It's my genuine pleasure to welcome Professor Peter Hain.
Britain now ships far more manufactured goods from China than it does to it. Just 20 years ago, China was a minor trading partner in world markets. Today, she's a mega trader, having overtaken the US as the world's leading supplier of merchandise exports. By 2030, China's share of such exports is forecast to be double that of the United States, 4 times that of Germany, and 10 times that of the UK. Has free trade and globalization failed too many people? Is the first question. Is Donald Trump's ascendancy to the US presidency part of a wider populist revolt against both globalization and free trade? Apart from his shocking ban on Muslims, in recent weeks, Trump has repealed laws that prevented US corporations from secretly paying foreign governments for mineral extraction rights, and that prevented coal companies from polluting freshwater streams that stopped US corporations from doing that. So he's repealed those laws. Where activists were campaigning for new or better laws to regulate such practices, now they're forced to defend the old ones that were doing some good but are under assault at the present time. Similarly, where many on the left, like me, criticized post-war settlement in international institutions like the United Nations, NATO, and the European Union as being either too US-dominated and or too beneficial for the rich and the powerful, we're now being forced to defend them against Trump and the far right who wish to tear them up. By aligning itself with Trump and leaving the European Union, the British government is threatening its future viability and survival, that's to say the EU's future viability and survival, especially if Trump fan Marine Le Pen wins the presidential election in May, as I wouldn't rule out at all. Launching her campaign last week, Marine Le Pen promised to put France first by freeing it from what she labeled the tyrannies of globalization, Islamic fundamentalism, and the European Union. She said, and I quote, "The divide is no longer between left and right, but between the patriots and the globalists." Tellingly, she added, financial globalization and Islamicist globalization are helping each other out. Those two ideologies aim to bring France to its knees. Interesting and poisonous, the bracketing of anti-Islam and anti-globalization. More wars were fought in Europe than any other part of the world over recent centuries. The European Union's put an end to that. Destroying it could unleash dangerously destructive forces now impacting across the world. At least some powerful global leaders have acknowledged their culpability in opening the door to such malevolent and reactionary forces. Last month, the head of the International Monetary Fund, Christine Lagarde, called for urgent action to tackle what she called a middle-class crisis hitting working people, as she warned that inequality, distrust, and a lack of hope were fueling growing populism. 8 billionaires own the same amount of wealth as the poorest half the world's population, 3.6 billion people. The fundamental challenge is that alongside its great benefits, every technological revolution mercilessly destroys jobs and livelihoods and therefore identities well before new ones emerge. Rather than a new golden era, globalization, he said, is associated with low wages, insecure employment, stateless corporations, and striking inequalities. The financial crisis had exposed how banks had been working, as he called it, in a heads I win, tails you lose bubble. In direct response, President Trump's election campaign conjured vivid ideas of a Western Shangri-La for working-class white American males. Above all, Trump appealed to Americans who felt left behind by globalization and technological change. Globalization has been good for many, but also grim for far too many. Which brings me to a painful truth. Donald Trump's victory has come as an overdue wake-up call to both conventional politics and orthodox economics. It's injected urgency into pleas for help from communities left behind by globalization and by free trade agreements. His plans to deregulate banking and cut corporation taxes will mainly help the rich and the powerful. Support in Britain for the neoliberal ideology that led to the 2008 global financial crisis, and the principal beneficiaries from the multi-billion taxpayer-funded bank bailouts. Yes, freeing up international trade by cutting import tariffs and removing non-tariff barriers to trade was supposed to boost the global economy, raise real incomes all round, and improve living standards across the board. And globalization has helped to do some of those things. But the recent gains may have been grossly exaggerated, as American Nobel economist Paul Krugman has demonstrated. Political leaders and economists have oversold the upside and potential of globalization and understated the downside risks. But although everyone may have benefited from lower priced imports, for many skilled and many unskilled manual workers, these gains have been wiped out by job losses in industries that cannot compete with their new foreign rivals. And the chickens came home to roost in the recent referendum on British membership of the European Union and in the US presidential election. But either put tackling climate change ahead of signing further trade agreements, or better still, build climate change commitments into those agreements, because the likely gains from further globalization aren't great and the threats of climate change are massive. Instead of Trump's bonfire of bank regulations, reform the financial system to reduce the risk of a second global credit crunch and consequential threat of complete economic collapse, like in 2008. Free education for all and skills training for any age, social security for the unemployed, and systems of care for children, the elderly, and the vulnerable members of society add up to what the Scandinavians call a flexi-security-based labour market. We can't afford to turn our back on globalisation, but unless we find ways to share the gains fairly and ensure that the inevitable casualties are supported into taking new opportunities, people, as they did over Brexit, Trump, and maybe Le Pen, will declare a plague on all your houses and walk away from free trade, simultaneously scapegoating sections of our community, currently Muslims. Our aim must be to give citizens the greater control they've demanded as they turn their backs on the political class, too often attracted by right-wing populist demagogues. Greater control, not protectionism, which would damage prosperity and feed xenophobia, but by ensuring government invests in new technology and retraining to replace old industrial jobs, ensure that immigration is not only focused upon high value-added or vacant jobs which cannot be filled domestically, but crucially also does not replace domestic jobs by undercutting wages and conditions, which is what has been happening across Europe and fueled a lot of this populist anger. Above all, such greater control means overturning the current neoliberal obsession with austerity and shrinking the state. The state's got to be efficient, obviously, and affordable financially, but shrinking it is disastrous. We can't actually cope with these problems if we have less government. We've got to have more government to support business and the economy. Trump has already vetoed the Trans-Pacific Trade Pact and plans to renegotiate the North American Free Trade Agreement, putting protectionism at the heart of his policy. This could collapse into a trade policy free-for-all, meaning trade wars feeding off protection and retaliation, precisely the policies of the 1930s, when trade barriers made recovery from the Great Depression more difficult. Yet his blunt warning to car makers that he'll impose charges and penalties if they shift plants out of the country to Mexico, for example, is both attractive and awkward for people of the left. Although maybe those car makers who acquiesce will be replacing their workers with robots anyway. So I conclude with words from the venture capitalist Bill Janeway. He says, "Today we may remain suspended in the paradox of politics. Securing financial stability and regenerating economic prosperity requires market interventions by governments deemed untrustworthy by broad sections of the populations they represent and are meant to serve. Reconciling people who are poles apart and bringing them together behind radical solutions is what my politics has always been about, and what we must do."